Doctor Who panel, all right? What do you bring to a party?
Cookies.
A banana. All right, everybody, hands in the air. Banana!
Banana!
My word, that was pathetic. You can't have your pudding if you don't eat your meat. All right, once again, for a good stretch. Hands in the air. Banana!
Banana!
Much better. So we have with us today Mr. Robert Olson.
Woo! Yeah!
It doesn't stop going to make sounds. No. You have to be very close.
All right, doesn't make sounds, that's okay. Right.
Be like a beatboxer.
Start it off.
Sure. So, this is Mr. Robert Olson. He's a wearable props and costume designer and maker. Is that
Designer, maker, costume, prop maker, that kind of thing, yeah.
He has worked with some people that you may have heard of. So, Tom Hill, something, David Tennant. It's just, anytime you talk to him, he's not name dropping, he's just talking about work. So, he has quite an interesting career, including working on costumes for the classic and new series. And this panel is going to be talking about his work with the 7th Doctor era.
That's sort of when I started working on the series was when Sylvester McCoy was in the lead role. And my first job, which wasn't my own job, I was still working for other people then. I was quite new, fresh out of college. So I think my first job on Doctor Who was I was asked to make an umbrella handle in the shape of a red question mark. And that was the very first thing I did on Doctor Who back then. And I've been doing stuff on the show with a few big gaps, but pretty much since then, including some stuff for the next season as well coming up.
Well, Robert, how did you end up doing something for Doctor Who? How did that happen?
I had always been a fan of the show. I always wanted to be able to maybe make something for the show, and I studied in theatre design for 3 years, thinking that would be a good way to get a career in making props and costumes. And once I'd finished studying, I went to work for an amazing costume prop maker called Martin Adams, who'd done a lot of other stuff on Doctor Who in the past. And it was while I was working for him that I got to work on the first season of the Sylvester McCoy stories.
Well, is there an application process? How did you apply to become a person who makes things?
Person to make things.
And it was very different, at risk of sounding really ancient, it was very different the way television worked in those days. So, Doctor Who wasn't made in Cardiff, it was made at TV Centre in London, and at that point the BBC still had a costume designer's office, it had a makeup department, things that it doesn't really have in the same way anymore. So I had a few friends who were also mod makers, prop makers, and we were all fans of the show, and we thought it would be a good idea to just phone the BBC, ask for an appointment, and go along there and say, give me some work. And when you're new and young and a bit stupid, you kind of do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That sounds
It's
familiar.
one of those deals, you don't know that's not the way it's done, so no one told you, so you just did it.
And in a way, that kind of was the way it was done then, really. You could just phone up the BBC switchboard, which was, I think in those days, it was 7438000 was the number. And you could just phone up and say, can you put me through to the costume designer's office, please? And they'd have an in-house team of maybe 20 costume designers who would get allocated to different shows. And we'd just find out who was doing Doctor Who, see if we could have a meeting, go along there, show some examples of work, and that's how I got to make stuff like the Candyman and various other things of the Sylvester McCoy era. You just kind of went along to TV Centre and asked for a job, really.
Well, we don't have a projector with us today, but who here has a smartphone on them? A smartphone with those intelligent mobile devices.
Mine's stupid.
Take out a very small independent website called Google. Type in the words Doctor Who and Candyman, and if you don't know what he's talking about, you might want to pull up this image and maybe show your friends and companions around you this very interesting robot. That what kind of robot was the Candyman?
Well, it was kind of like this robot I have on my T-shirt.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
He has a visual. Your visual is you take off his clothing, like, this is what I made.
It's a very strange idea from the story Happiness Patrol that the main villain was a robot, kind of made to look like it was made out of giant sweets, which at the time I thought was a really stupid idea. But I'd been given the job, so I had to do it and make it work. And for a while, it felt like a bit of an embarrassment almost to have done this creation. But now, I think quite a few people saw it when they were children and were quite scared by it, and it's got a bit more of a kind of a bit more credibility now than it maybe had with the fans at the time, really, hopefully.
Has anyone pulled up a picture of Candyman on your device? Isn't it kind of cool looking what he made? It is, isn't it?
I have a question to ask. Did it taste like candy?
Oh, it tastes like candy. It's good.
The feet would have tasted like candy because the costume designer, the makeup designer decided that it was a good idea to make the feet stick to the studio floor by putting a sugary solution on the studio floor, which was really not a good idea.
I've been to a lot of bars where my feet stick to the ground. Is that because
It was very much the same effect, yes. Yeah. But apart from that, most of it would have tasted like fiberglass, really.
I've never actually ate fiberglass, but I bet it tastes delicious.
Well, what else did you do in the classic series?
I did some helmets to some human characters in the story Dragonfire.
So we have some younger fans here and some older fans that might not have seen all the episodes. What happened in Dragonfire?
I don't remember a lot about it. I remember there was an effect of someone melting, their face melted, and some friends of mine did the melting effect, which worked very well.
So they did melt.
They did melt. There was a kind of visual effects shot of the rear of the character kind of shriveling and collapsing, and the way the visual effects department thought would be the perfect way to go with this was to get an inflatable life-size human doll available from specialist outlets, dress that in the costume and then film it from the back as they slowly let the air out of it. So this effect shot, it was probably...
Stay classy, stay classy.
Yeah. It was probably the last shot of the day, as the effect shot usually is. So they got it lined up, got this thing inflated, put the costume on. It looked kind of okay from the back. Okay, good luck studio, roll cameras. They start to deflate it. What happens? Of course, instantly the trousers fall down. Or pants, as you would say.
As people do.
So possibly not very impressive from that point of view, but the version of it for the close-ups of the face that my friends Sue Moore and Steve Mansfield did worked very well. That was a wax portrait sculpt of the actor's head that had hot air blowing at it, and that melted and disintegrated.
And who were helmets in the episode?
It was the same, I can't remember what they were called, but they were just like military helmets. Not very exciting to anyone other than me, because I was working on Doctor Who, really.
So you were a fanboy who got to work on your favorite show.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And then I think there was another story, Ghostlight, which was the last show to be recorded before they axed the series, and I did a costume for the main character called Light in that, and some armour for another one, Battlefield, where there were kind of armoured knights that were kind of meant to look futuristic, but there wasn't really the money to do that, so we just had to make them as economically as possible using some bits from from the BBC stock department costume store.
So you do the wearable prop and costume design quite a bit for the new series, and you did for the classic. Budget-wise, how different is life now that you have more than 29 pounds an episode to work with, split among everyone?
It's strangely not that difficult, not that different really, in a way, because back then in the 80s, at least you had the resources of the BBC had a fantastic costume store with like tens of thousands of costumes, so you could go and pull a lot of stock from the costume store. Now, about 10 years ago, the BBC sold all that off, so it's kind of harder in a way now because there isn't all that stock to pull costumes from. You have to either make everything or pay to hire it from costume houses. So, although the budget's better, in some ways it still feels very underfunded because the challenges are a bit greater in a way.
Well, this was during the 80s, correct?
Yeah, it was mid to late, I think late 80s, I think, Sylvester McCoy, yeah.
For those of you who do not know, that was during a time period called the Cold War. I fought it.
I bet it was cold.
When, in this Cold War era, what other costume and prop jobs did you have outside of Lulu?
I did lots of other BBC things, various comedy shows, a few films I worked on. There was a film called The Last Emperor that won lots of Oscars. That was a Bernardo Bertolucci big budget film shot in China.
What did you do with that?
I think I made about 1,000 hats for that, and did lots of other things like made fingernail covers and various other things. Buttons. I think I spent my 22nd birthday working through the night trying to make 1,000 buttons. Lots of other stuff, lots of stuff you won't have heard of because it was opera or theatre, or I did lots of work for the National Theatre in London. But it was still a lot of Doctor Who. As much as I could, I'd try and work on Doctor Who.
Do you still do much in the way of theatre?
I do. I still do a variety of stuff at the moment. I'm working on a new show at the National Theatre in London. And I've also been doing a few film projects recently, along with a couple of interesting new TV dramas.
Yeah.
So I've always done a mix of film, TV and theatre, and that kind of helps to keep it interesting, really.
You mentioned to me that you, at the theatre, you were working and made some costumes for someone who was from the new series of Doctor Who recently.
Did I? Oh, yes.
Did I?
Yeah, I just
You can read
did a job at the National Theatre with the lovely Arthur Darvill, better known to you as Rory. He was in a production of Treasure Island at the National Theatre, and I got to make his leg for that. So it was really nice to work with him. He's a really nice guy.
So you know the inseam of most of England's actor base.
Oh, yes.
That's a very interesting. Your .com, which was updated back in '74, you should make that your new tagline. Yeah. Well, do you have any questions about the Seventh Doctor era classic series Doctor Who, or questions for gentlemen who worked on both all the current series and the ye olden days, back when television was a thing that was slightly rounded and you had ears that you had to manipulate to make it make pictures. Does anybody have any questions for us?
What would you, do you have one project that sticks out in your mind as the most difficult that you've ever had to tackle?
I think really the most difficult things were when I was just starting out and I didn't really know how to do things. So from that point of view, like making sets of armour for Hamlet at the National Theatre when I had no idea really what I was doing was more difficult. But as things go on, the challenge now is never how to do something, it's always how to do it in the time and with the money.
Well, how did you work on Fenric?
Yes,
Yes.
I forgot about that
Yes.
one, yeah.
What did you create? The Curse of Fenric. That was with the Hemivores, wasn't it?
It was the Herbivores at the H